Miss Callahan sighed as the final bell echoed through the halls, signaling the end of another school day. The sounds of children laughing and shouting filled the corridors as they poured out of classrooms, eager to escape into the freedom of the afternoon. She began the routine task of tidying her classroom, straightening chairs, and gathering loose papers left behind by her energetic third graders. Outside, parents lined up to pick up their children, chatting with one another in the late afternoon sun. As Miss Callahan moved toward her desk, her gaze caught on a small figure standing quietly in the back corner of the room. Jimmy, the shy boy who rarely spoke more than a few words in class, stood motionless, staring at the floor, his hands gripping the straps of his backpack. Miss Callahan frowned slightly. It wasn't unusual for Jimmy to linger after school, but today there was something different about him. His small shoulders were tense, and his eyes flickered toward the door with an unmistakable look of fear. "Jimmy," she called softly, moving toward him. "Are you all right, honey?" He didn't respond, only shifting his feet nervously as he kept his gaze firmly on the ground. Miss Callahan crouched down to his level, her gentle voice coaxing, "Is someone picking you up today?" Jimmy nodded, but the action seemed mechanical, devoid of the usual childlike enthusiasm. Miss Callahan's instincts, honed by years of teaching, began to tingle. Something was wrong. The air in the room, once light with the energy of children, now felt heavy with unspoken tension. Her eyes flicked toward the door, where the last of the children were filing out to meet their parents. The sunlight outside seemed too bright, too cheerful compared to the growing unease in her gut. She straightened slowly, her mind running through possibilities. Was someone coming for Jimmy? Had his parents told the office about any changes in pickup arrangements? Before she could ask another question, a shadow crossed the doorway. A man stood there, tall and confident, his smile polite but not quite reaching his eyes. He looked familiar, though Miss Callahan couldn't immediately place him. The man stepped into the classroom, his voice smooth as he addressed her. "Hi there, I'm here to pick up Jimmy. I'm his uncle." Miss Callahan smiled politely, but couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The man's appearance, clean-cut and seemingly put together, should have put her at ease, but it didn't. Her years of experience had taught her to trust her gut, and right now, her gut was telling her to be cautious. "Oh, I wasn't aware that Jimmy's uncle was picking him up today," she said, her voice friendly but probing. "Did the office confirm this?" The man's smile wavered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Yeah, his mom asked me to pick him up last minute. She had something come up and couldn't make it." Miss Callahan turned her gaze back to Jimmy. The boy hadn't moved. In fact, his posture seemed to stiffen even more at the mention of his uncle. She noticed the way his small hands clenched tightly around the straps of his backpack, his knuckles white. There was fear in his eyes, fear that hadn't been there before. "Isn't that right, Jimmy?" the man prompted, glancing down at the boy. Jimmy didn't respond. He didn't nod, didn't shake his head, didn't move at all. His silence screamed louder than any words could have. Miss Callahan's smile faltered, and she straightened her shoulders, feeling the weight of the situation settle onto them. She knew this feeling, the quiet unease that crept in when something was wrong but couldn't yet be proven. "Why don't you come with me to the office, Jimmy?" she suggested, her voice deliberately light. "We'll just double-check with your mom, okay?" The man's expression tightened, but he didn't protest. "Not yet, at least." "Sure, that's fine," he said, his tone still smooth, but there was an edge to it now. Miss Callahan led the way, keeping Jimmy close beside her. The boy's small hand brushed against her sleeve, and she felt the faint tremor in his touch. She glanced down at him, offering a reassuring smile. As they reached the hallway, the man followed close behind, his footsteps too loud in the empty space. Miss Callahan's mind raced. She didn't want to make any accusations without evidence, but the fear in Jimmy's eyes was enough for her to know she had to be careful. They reached the office door, and she paused, glancing at the man once more before opening it. Inside, the school secretary looked up, surprised to see them. "Miss Callahan, is everything all right?" Miss Callahan nodded slowly, her hand gently resting on Jimmy's shoulder. "This gentleman says he's here to pick up Jimmy." He says he's the boy's uncle, but I just wanted to double-check with his mother to make sure everything is in order. The secretary's brow furrowed as she reached for the phone. I'll give her a call right now. As the phone rang, Miss Callahan felt the man's eyes on her, sharp and calculating. She didn't flinch, but her pulse quickened. Something was definitely wrong. The secretary hung up the phone a moment later, her expression shifting from confusion to concern. No answer, she said quietly. I'll try again in a few minutes. The man's polite facade began to crack. There's really no need for all this, he said, his voice growing impatient. I already told you. His mom asked me to pick him up. Miss Callahan met his gaze, her smile gone. I understand, but I'd like to hear that from his mother directly. The tension in the room thickened as the minutes ticked by. Miss Callahan's grip on Jimmy's shoulder tightened slightly, and the boy leaned into her, as if silently pleading for her to protect him. Miss Callahan felt Jimmy's slight tremble beside her, a tremble so subtle that most might have missed it, but she couldn't. Her senses were heightened, every fiber of her being attuned to the boy's growing fear. She gave him a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder, trying to project calmness despite the storm of unease brewing within her. The man, who still hadn't offered any form of identification, shifted impatiently by the doorway. Look, I don't know why we're making such a big deal out of this. I've picked him up before. It's not like I'm a stranger. Miss Callahan kept her eyes on Jimmy. He stood frozen, still clutching his backpack like a lifeline. Her heart ached at the sight of his fear that had deepened with every word his uncle spoke. But it wasn't just his silence. It was his eyes, wide, unblinking, pleading. He hadn't voiced any objections, hadn't said a word, but Miss Callahan didn't need words. His body language screamed louder than any protest could. She crouched down beside him again, speaking softly, almost in a whisper, so only Jimmy could hear. Jimmy, if there's anything you need to tell me, it's okay. I'm here to help. For a brief moment, Jimmy's eyes flickered with something. Was a hope? But before he could respond, the man interrupted, his tone growing sharper. We don't have time for this, he snapped. Let's go, Jimmy. Jimmy flinched. That small movement was all it took for Miss Callahan to make up her mind. Her eyes hardened as she stood up to face the man. She had trusted her instincts before, and they had never failed her. She wasn't about to start second-guessing them now. I'm sorry, but I won't release Jimmy until I speak to his mother directly, she said firmly, her voice leaving no room for argument. The man's facade cracked further, his polite demeanor slipping away entirely. This is ridiculous, he muttered under his breath, his jaw clenched. I don't have time for this. Miss Callahan kept her gaze steady, refusing to be intimidated. You're welcome to wait until we hear back from his mother, she said, her voice calm but unwavering. It shouldn't be long. The man's eyes darkened, and for the first time, she saw a flash of something that sent a chill down her spine. Anger. Controlled, simmering anger. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, but it was enough to confirm what she had suspected all along. Something wasn't right. The secretary, sensing the tension, picked up the phone again, her fingers moving faster this time. Let me try one more time, she said, glancing nervously between Miss Callahan and the man. Miss Callahan barely registered the conversation happening around her. Her focus was on Jimmy, on keeping him safe. She leaned down once more, lowering her voice so only he could hear. You're okay, Jimmy, she whispered. I won't let anything happen to you. Jimmy blinked up at her, his wide eyes full of unspoken gratitude. The seconds dragged by, each one feeling heavier than the last, as Miss Callahan waited for a sign, for some proof that she wasn't overreacting. But deep down, she knew that Jimmy's fear wasn't imagined, knew that the man standing before her was not to be trusted. The phone rang again, its shrill sound slicing through the tense silence. The secretary picked up quickly, speaking in hushed tones. Miss Callahan watched her closely, hoping for some confirmation, anything that would give her the leverage she needed to protect Jimmy. The man took a step closer, and though his voice was still calm, there was a coldness in his words. Look, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but I'm his uncle, his family. You can't just keep him here. Miss Callahan turned to face him fully, her expression unreadable. She was no longer just a teacher. She was Jimmy's protector now, and that role came with a different set of rules. I understand your frustration, but I'm responsible for these children while they're in my care. I can't release him until I'm certain everything is in order. His expression shifted again, and this time it was unmistakable anger. His patience was wearing thin, and Miss Callahan could feel the tension rising. She was walking a fine line now, balancing between doing what was right for Jimmy and avoiding an open confrontation with a man she barely knew. The secretary hung up the phone and looked at Miss Callahan, her expression tight with concern. "Still no answer," she said quietly. Miss Callahan's stomach dropped. She had hoped for something, anything, that would ease the situation, but instead, the silence on the other end of the line only deepened her sense of dread. Before she could respond, the man took another step forward, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. "We're leaving now." Miss Callahan didn't move, standing her ground. "No, you're not," she said evenly. "Not until I speak with his mother." The air in the room grew thick with tension. The secretary stood frozen behind her desk, watching the exchange with wide eyes. Jimmy, still silent, pressed closer to Miss Callahan, seeking her protection. The man's face contorted with barely controlled rage. For a moment, Miss Callahan thought he might actually lash out, but instead, he exhaled sharply, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "This is a waste of time," he muttered, his voice dripping with contempt. Miss Callahan knew she had pushed him to his limit, but she didn't care. Jimmy's safety was the only thing that mattered now. "If you'd like, we can wait for the police," she suggested, keeping her voice calm even as her heart pounded in her chest. At the mention of the police, the man's eyes flickered with something. Panic? Fear? Whatever it was gone in an instant, replaced by cold indifference. He took a step back, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Fine," he spat. "You want to make this difficult? Go ahead. But don't say I didn't warn you." Miss Callahan didn't respond, holding his gaze until he turned and stormed out of the office. The door slammed behind him with a force that reverberated through the room, leaving an uneasy silence in its wake. Miss Callahan let out a shaky breath, glancing down at Jimmy, who still clung to her side. She crouched down again, her voice soft. "It's okay, Jimmy. He's gone." Jimmy nodded, but the fear in his eyes hadn't faded completely. Miss Callahan knew this wasn't over. Not yet. There were still too many unanswered questions, too many unknowns. And until she had the answers, she wasn't letting Jimmy out of her sight. The air in the office seemed to settle slightly after the man's departure, but Miss Callahan knew the danger hadn't passed. She felt it lingering, like a shadow at the edge of her consciousness. Jimmy was still gripping her hand tightly, his small fingers trembling against hers. The secretary, wide-eyed and unsettled, broke the silence first. "What do we do now, Miss Callahan?" Her voice wavered, her earlier composure shaken by the tension of the confrontation. Miss Callahan took a deep breath, forcing herself to think clearly. "I'm going to call Jimmy's mother directly," she said, keeping her tone calm and decisive. She needed to maintain control of the situation, both for Jimmy's sake and her own. She crouched beside Jimmy again, meeting his wide eyes. "Jimmy, I'm going to call your mom, okay? Don't worry. We'll figure this out." Her voice was soothing, but inside, a storm was brewing. Something about that man, his impatience, his simmering anger, had set off alarm bells that Miss Callahan couldn't ignore. She dialed the number that had been provided on Jimmy's file, the phone ringing in her ear as she held her breath. "Come on, pick up." After what felt like an eternity, a voice crackled on the other end. "Hello." Miss Callahan exhaled in relief. "Mrs. Thompson, this is Miss Callahan, Jimmy's teacher." "Oh, Miss Callahan, is everything all right?" The voice on the other end sounded strained, almost frantic. The tone sent a chill down Miss Callahan's spine. "We've had a bit of a situation here," Miss Callahan began carefully, her eyes drifting to Jimmy, who had inched closer to her side. "A man claiming to be Jimmy's uncle came to pick him up, but I wanted to confirm with you before releasing him." There was a pause on the other end, a pause that seemed to stretch on for too long. Finally, Mrs. Thompson's voice broke the silence, filled with alarm. "What? No one was supposed to pick up Jimmy but me. He doesn't have an uncle." Ms. Callahan's heart sank. The cold dread that had been gnawing at her gut solidified into hard certainty. She had been right to trust her instincts, but now the situation was even more dire than she had imagined. "I'm so glad you called me," Mrs. Thompson continued, her voice trembling with fear. "I'm leaving work now. I'll be there as soon as I can. Please don't let him leave with anyone." "I won't," Ms. Callahan promised, her grip tightening on the phone. "We'll keep him safe until you get here." She hung up the phone, her mind racing. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but they painted a far darker picture than she had anticipated. Jimmy wasn't just afraid of his uncle. He was in real danger. Ms. Callahan turned to the secretary, who was still staring at her in shock. "We need to alert security," she said, her voice firm. "That man, whoever he is, could still be around. We can't let him come back." The secretary nodded quickly, grabbing the phone to call security. Ms. Callahan kept a protective arm around Jimmy, her senses on high alert. The office door felt too fragile, too exposed. She needed to make sure they were safe until Jimmy's mother arrived. The minutes ticked by slowly, each one a little heavier than the last. Ms. Callahan kept steady hand on Jimmy's shoulder, trying to calm the boy even as her own heart raced. The school security staff had been alerted, but that wasn't enough to ease the tension thrumming through her. She couldn't shake the feeling that danger was still lurking nearby, waiting for the right moment to strike. Jimmy remained quiet, but his fear was palpable, radiating off him like heat. Ms. Callahan glanced down at him, offering a small smile. "It's going to be okay, Jimmy. Your mom's on her way." The boy nodded, but the haunted look in his eyes didn't fade. Ms. Callahan wished she could do more to reassure him, but until Jimmy's mother arrived, all she could do was keep him close and hope the situation didn't escalate further. The door to the office swung open suddenly, and Ms. Callahan's heart leapt into her throat. But it wasn't the man returning. It was Mr. Bradley, the head of school security, his burly frame filling the doorway. "Ms. Callahan," he greeted, his voice steady but concerned. "I've been briefed on the situation. We got guards stationed at every exit now, and we're scanning the security footage to see if we can spot this guy." Ms. Callahan nodded in relief, grateful for the extra precautions. "Thank you, Mr. Bradley. Jimmy's mother is on her way now." She confirmed that the man wasn't anyone authorized to pick him up. Mr. Bradley's expression darkened. "That's what I was afraid of. We'll keep a close eye on things until she gets here." As he spoke, the secretary hung up the phone with a sigh of relief. "I just got off the phone with Mrs. Thompson again. She's 10 minutes away." Ms. Callahan exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly. But even with security in place, she couldn't relax completely. "Not yet. We'll stay here until she arrives," she said, her voice firm. The minutes crawled by, each one stretching Ms. Callahan's nerves thin. The office felt too small, too quiet. The ticking clock on the wall, a constant reminder of the time slipping by. Every now and then, her mind would wander back to the man, the way his calm facade had shattered in the face of her resistance, the thinly veiled anger in his eyes. What would he have done if she hadn't stepped in? What if he came back? She shook the thought away, focusing on Jimmy. The boy was still silent, still clutching his backpack, as if it was the only thing anchoring him to reality. She wished she could take away his fear, wished she could make him feel safe again. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the office door opened once more, and this time, it was Mrs. Thompson who rushed in, her face pale with worry. "Jimmy," she called, her voice trembling with relief. Jimmy's head snapped up, his eyes filling with tears as he ran to his mother, throwing his arms around her waist. Mrs. Thompson dropped to her knees, pulling him into a tight hug. "Oh, thank God," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Thank God you're okay." Ms. Callahan watched the reunion with a mixture of relief and lingering anxiety. Jimmy was safe now, but the questions still burned in her mind. Who was that man? What did he want with Jimmy? And how had he known where to find him? Mrs. Thompson turned to Miss Callahan, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for keeping him safe." Ms. Callahan smiled softly. "I'm just glad I listened to my instincts." But even as she spoke, she knew this wasn't over. There was more to this story, more than any of them could see. And until she had the answers, she wouldn't rest easy. As the office door closed behind Jimmy's mother, a wave of relief washed over Ms. Callahan. But it was fleeting. The day's events had left too many unanswered questions, and the weight of uncertainty still pressed heavily on her chest. Jimmy was safe for now, but there was no telling how long it would last. Who was that man? Why had he targeted Jimmy? Ms. Callahan paced the now quiet office, her mind racing through the possibilities. She had always been one to trust her instincts, but this was different. This was a situation where instincts alone weren't enough. She needed answers, concrete ones, and quickly. As she mulled over the day's events, Mr. Bradley re-entered the office, his expression grim. He held a small tablet in his hand. The screen lit up with what appeared to be security footage. "We've reviewed the tapes," Mr. Bradley said, his voice low. "The man left the school grounds shortly after your confrontation with him." But he paused, his brow furrowing as he showed her the screen. Ms. Callahan leaned in, her eyes narrowing as she watched the footage. It showed the man walking toward the main exit, but before leaving, he stopped and looked over his shoulder, scanning the area. His gaze lingered on the playground, where the remaining children were playing, and his expression darkened. "What is he looking at?" Ms. Callahan asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Bradley shook his head. "We're not sure, but the fact that he was watching the other kids concerns me. He might not be done with whatever plan he had in mind." Ms. Callahan's stomach turned. The idea that the man could still pose a threat was terrifying. But what disturbed her more was the possibility that Jimmy wasn't the only target. "Have you contacted the authorities?" she asked, her voice tight with concern. Mr. Bradley nodded. "The police are on their way. We're treating this as an attempted abduction, but we need more information before we can move forward." Ms. Callahan bit her lip, her mind swirling with 1,000 thoughts. There had to be more to this than a simple abduction attempt. The man's anger, his insistence on taking Jimmy, and his cold, calculating demeanor all pointed to something far more sinister. But what? And why Jimmy? "I'm going to stay here until the police arrive," she said, her decision firm. "I want to make sure they have all the information they need." Mr. Bradley gave her a nod of approval. "That's a good idea. I'll let them know you're here to provide your statement." As Mr. Bradley stepped out to meet the arriving officers, Ms. Callahan sat down at one of the desks, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the image of a man's face, the coldness in his eyes, the barely controlled rage simmering beneath his polite exterior. It was as though he had been playing a role, putting on a mask to blend in, but the moment things didn't go his way, that mask had cracked. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the office door opening again. This time, it was one of the school's administrative assistants, her face pale with worry. "Ms. Callahan, the police are here to take your statement." Ms. Callahan nodded and stood, mentally preparing herself for what was to come. She had faced tough situations before, but nothing quite like this. As she walked toward the door, she couldn't help but glance at the playground again. The children were still playing, blissfully unaware of the danger that had almost befallen one of their classmates. She shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. Something about today felt unfinished, and until she knew for certain that Jimmy and every other child at this school was safe, she wouldn't rest. The police officers, 2 tall men in uniform, stood just outside the office, their expressions serious but calm. Ms. Callahan took a deep breath before stepping forward to greet them. "Good afternoon, ma'am," one of the officers said, extending a hand. "I'm Officer Davis, and this is Officer Martinez. We're here to gather all the details regarding the incident earlier today." Ms. Callahan shook their hands, grateful for their presence. "Thank you for coming so quickly," she said, her voice steady despite the unease gnawing at her insides. "Of course," Officer Davis replied. "We understand the situation is serious. Could you walk us through what happened from the moment the man arrived at the schools?" Ms. Callahan recounted everything. How Jimmy had lingered behind after school, the man's sudden appearance claiming to be his uncle, and the way Jimmy had silently pleaded for help without saying a word. She described the tension that had built, the man's growing impatience, and the eventual confrontation that had led to him storming out of the office. The officers listened intently, jotting down notes as she spoke. When she finished, Officer Martinez frowned slightly, tapping his pen against the notepad. "It sounds like you did everything right," he said. "Trusting your instincts probably prevented something terrible from happening." Ms. Callahan nodded, though the weight of the situation still hung heavy on her. "But why Jimmy? Why did he target him?" Officer Davis exchanged a glance with his partner before speaking. "We don't know for sure yet, but based on what you've told us, it's possible this man has been watching the school for a while, maybe even planning this for some time. He could have picked Jimmy at random, or there could be something about him specifically that drew the man's attention." The thought sent a chill down Ms. Callahan's spine. The idea that someone could be watching these children, waiting for the right moment to strike, was terrifying. "Do you think he'll come back?" she asked, her voice quiet but urgent. Officer Davis sighed, his expression somber. "It's hard to say, but we'll be increasing patrols around the school for the next few days, and we've already started investigating. If he does come back, we'll be ready." Ms. Callahan felt a small measure of relief, but it wasn't enough to erase the fear gnawing at her. She thanked the officers for their time, promising to stay in touch if she remembered any more details. But as they left, she couldn't shake the feeling that the situation wasn't over. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the office door. Mr. Bradley stepped in, his face set in a grim expression. "I've just spoken with the principal," he said. "We're taking extra security measures starting tomorrow. No one gets in or out without proper identification and verification." Ms. Callahan nodded, appreciating the swift action, but something still gnawed at her. The man had been too calm, too prepared. She had a feeling this wouldn't be the last they heard of him. "Good," she said quietly, "but let's not let our guard down. I don't think he's finished." As she left the office and made her way back to her classroom to gather her belongings, Miss Callahan couldn't help but glance out the window one last time. The playground was empty now, the sun casting long shadows over the grass. A strange feeling washed over her, like the calm before a storm. She couldn't shake the sense that something darker was still lurking just beyond the surface. And until she uncovered the truth, she wouldn't let her guard down. The next morning, the atmosphere at the school was different. There was an undercurrent of tension, a collective unease that seemed to settle over the teachers and staff. Ms. Callahan arrived early, her mind still swirling with the events of the previous day. The man's face, his cold, calculating expression, lingered in her thoughts, refusing to leave her in peace. As she walked through the hallways, she noticed the heightened security presence. Several guards were stationed at the entrances, checking IDs and watching the flow of parents and children entering the school grounds. It was a relief, but it wasn't enough to dispel the knot of anxiety that had taken residence in Ms. Callahan's chest. Jimmy wasn't in class yet. Ms. Callahan tried to push her worry aside as she prepared for the day, setting out the lesson plan and arranging the students' desks. The other children arrived, their usual chatter filling the room, but every few minutes, her eyes darted to the door, waiting for Jimmy to appear. 20 minutes passed, and still no sign of him. The familiar feeling of dread began to creep back in, tightening around her throat. She checked the clock again, her heart pounding a little faster with each second that ticked by. Finally, the door creaked open, and Jimmy stepped inside. Ms. Callahan let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, relief flooding through her. But something was different. Jimmy's face was pale, and his usual quiet demeanor seemed even more subdued, as though a weight was pressing down on him. Ms. Callahan's instincts flared again. She had learned to trust them, and today they were screaming that something wasn't right. She walked over to him, kneeling down to meet his eyes. "Good morning, Jimmy," she said softly. "Everything okay?" Jimmy glanced up at her, his lips pressed into a thin line. His eyes, normally wide with curiosity, were clouded with something else, something darker. He gave a small nod, but Miss Callahan wasn't convinced. "Are you sure?" she asked gently, lowering her voice so the other students couldn't hear. "You can tell me if something's wrong. I'm here to help." For a long moment, Jimmy didn't answer. He fidgeted with the straps of his backpack, avoiding her gaze. Then, in the faintest whisper, he said, "He was outside my house this morning." Miss Callahan's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jimmy's small hands tightened around his backpack straps, his knuckles white. "I saw him," he murmured. He was standing outside, watching. Miss Callahan's heart pounded in her chest. She had known the man wasn't finished, but to know he had been watching Jimmy's house, that he had gotten that close, sent a wave of fear crashing over her. "Did you tell your mom?" she asked, her voice calm despite the panic bubbling beneath the surface. Jimmy nodded. "She called the police." "I'm scared." Miss Callahan placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, though her own fear was gnawing at her. "You did the right thing, Jimmy. And your mom did the right thing by calling the police. You're safe here, okay? We've got security, and I'm here. I won't let anything happen to you." Jimmy nodded again, but the fear in his eyes didn't fade. Miss Callahan gave him a small, comforting smile, trying to project calm even though her mind was racing. She needed to speak with the principal with security. Everyone needed to know that the man had returned. Miss Callahan didn't waste any time. As soon as the students were settled into their seats, she excused herself and made her way to the principal's office. Her mind was running through 100 different scenarios, each one worse than the last. If the man was bold enough to show up at Jimmy's house, there was no telling what he might do next. She knocked on the door, her anxiety barely masked as the principal, Mr. Howard, opened it. "Miss Callahan, come in," he said, his expression immediately concerned. "What's going on?" Miss Callahan quickly explained what Jimmy had told her, watching as Mr. Howard's face darkened with every word. "We need to alert the police again," she finished. "He's not going to stop." Mr. Howard nodded, his jaw set in a hard line. "I'll contact the authorities right away. We'll need to increase security measures even more. This has escalated beyond what we anticipated." Within minutes, the police were called and the school was placed on high alert. The presence of security guards doubled, and patrols around the school grounds became more frequent. It was a precaution, but Miss Callahan couldn't shake the feeling that it still wasn't enough. By the time she returned to her classroom, the weight of responsibility hung heavily on her shoulders. She glanced over at Jimmy, who was quietly working on an assignment, his small frame hunched over his desk. The fear in his eyes had dimmed slightly, but it was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of lessons and activities, but Miss Callahan's mind never left the thought of that man, waiting, watching. She knew they had to be prepared for whatever came next. Around noon, just as the students were lining up for lunch, there was a knock on the classroom door. Miss Callahan's heart skipped a beat, but when she opened the door, it was Officer Davis, the policeman from the day before. "Miss Callahan," he greeted, his tone serious but steady. "We've increased patrols around Jimmy's house and the school, but I wanted to speak with you directly. We've got reason to believe the man might attempt to make contact again." Miss Callahan's pulse quickened. "Why? What makes you think that?" Officer Davis shifted, his eyes scanning the room briefly before continuing. "Based on his behavior, we think he's not acting randomly. He's been planning this for a while. The fact that he showed up at Jimmy's house indicates he's getting more desperate." The word desperate sent a chill down Miss Callahan's spine. Desperation made people unpredictable, dangerous. "So what do we do now?" she asked, her voice tight with concern. "We've got officers stationed at both ends of the street near Jimmy's house, and we're monitoring the school closely," Officer Davis replied. "But we need to be ready for anything. If you notice anything suspicious, even the smallest detail, you need to let us know immediately." Miss Callahan nodded, her mind racing. She had already been vigilant, but now it felt like every moment was a potential turning point. "Of course," she said. I'll keep my eyes open." As Officer Davis left, Miss Callahan returned to her desk, her heart still pounding. The man was getting more desperate. That meant they were running out of time. The rest of the afternoon passed slowly, each minute feeling longer than the last. The tension in the air was almost suffocating, and Miss Callahan couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. She kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see the man lurking just outside, waiting for his moment. When the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Miss Callahan felt her muscles tense even further. She walked Jimmy to the front of the school, where his mother was waiting, the police standing nearby. As they left, Miss Callahan watched them go, her heart heavy with the weight of the unknown. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more fear. But for now, Jimmy was safe, and that was all that mattered. The quiet of the evening was a stark contrast to the chaos that had gripped the school earlier. Miss Callahan sat at her kitchen table, the remnants of a barely touched dinner sitting cold on the plate before her. She stared blankly at the steam rising from her mug of tea, but her mind was miles away, retracing every step, every word, every fleeting moment of the day's events. Jimmy was safe for now. His mother had taken him home under the watchful eyes of the police, and the heightened security measures at the school had brought a small measure of comfort. But it wasn't enough to erase the nagging feeling that something was still amiss. The man's persistence, his desperation, it all pointed to a larger, more sinister plan that hadn't yet fully revealed itself. Miss Callahan couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something, that somewhere, buried beneath the surface of it all, was a clue, a piece of the puzzle they hadn't yet discovered. And until they did, the threat would remain, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The buzzing of her phone jolted her from her thoughts. She glanced down at the screen and saw an incoming call from Officer Davis. "Miss Callahan," he greeted after she answered. His voice sounded tense, more so than it had earlier in the day. "I wanted to give you an update." She straightened in her chair, her pulse quickening. Did something happen? Officer Davis sighed, and for a moment, there was only silence on the other end of the line. "We've done some more digging into this man," he said finally, "and it looks like this wasn't a random attempt. He's been linked to several cases of attempted abductions across the state. But here's where it gets complicated. None of the kids he targeted were chosen at random." A chill ran down Miss Callahan's spine. "What do you mean?" "The children he's gone after all have something in common. They're connected to someone who this man has a grudge against. We're still piecing together the details, but we think this goes deeper than we initially thought." Miss Callahan's mind raced. Jimmy, the fear in his eyes, the way the man had zeroed in on him, ignoring everything else. Was Jimmy's family involved in something they hadn't disclosed? Had his mother crossed paths with this man before? "What should we do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "For now, we're keeping the police presence around Jimmy's house and the school," Officer Davis replied. "But I wanted to make sure you knew this wasn't over. We've alerted Jimmy's mother, and we're working to get to the bottom of this." Miss Callahan thanked him and hung up, her mind swirling with new questions. None of this was random. The man had been watching, planning, waiting, and that meant he wasn't finished yet. She leaned back in her chair, her heart heavy with the weight of the unknown. The stakes had risen, and now it wasn't just about protecting Jimmy. It was about uncovering the truth behind the man's motives before it was too late. The next few days passed in a blur of tension and vigilance. The increased security at the school provided a temporary sense of safety, but Miss Callahan knew it wasn't a permanent solution. Each morning, as she greeted her students and watched them file into the classroom, she couldn't help but glance toward the windows, scanning the grounds for any sign of danger. Jimmy was back in class, his presence quiet but steady. He seemed to be recovering from the fear that had gripped him, though the shadows in his eyes had not fully disappeared. Miss Callahan kept a close eye on him, offering reassurance whenever she could. She wanted to believe that they had seen the last of the man, but something in her gut told her otherwise. It was just before the lunch break when Miss Callahan received a call from Mr. Howard, the principal. She stepped into the hallway to take it, her heart pounding in her chest as she wondered what new development had come to light. Ms. Callahan, Mr. Howard began, his tone serious. I wanted to inform you that the police have made an arrest. The man who attempted to take Jimmy, he's in custody. Ms. Callahan exhaled in relief, her shoulders sagging as the tension that had coiled in her body for days finally began to release. Thank God, she murmured. What happens now? They're still investigating his motives, Mr. Howard continued. But they've linked him to multiple attempted abductions, as well as some unresolved cases from the past. It seems this has been going on for a long time. A long time. Ms. Callahan shuddered at the thought. How many children had been targeted? How many families had been affected by this man's actions? Do they know why he went after Jimmy? She asked. They're working on it, Mr. Howard replied. But from what the detectives have told me, it's possible that Jimmy's family might have some connection to the man, though his mother doesn't seem to know anything about it. Ms. Callahan's mind raced, but before she could ask any more questions, Mr. Howard added, in the meantime, I wanted to thank you, Ms. Callahan. If it weren't for your quick thinking and your instincts, this could have ended very differently. His words brought a wave of emotion crashing over her. She hadn't allowed herself to truly process the gravity of the situation until now. The idea that Jimmy and other children had been so close to danger and that her actions had played a role in preventing something terrible was overwhelming. After the call ended, Ms. Callahan stood in the hallway for a few moments, her thoughts swirling. The man was in custody, but there were still so many questions. Why had he targeted Jimmy? What grudge had driven him to such desperation? But for now, Jimmy was safe, and that was what mattered most. When she returned to the classroom, the students were preparing for lunch, their chatter filling the room with a lightness that Miss Callahan hadn't felt in days. She smiled at Jimmy, who was packing up his books, and for the first time in a while, he smiled back. A real smile. As she watched him, Miss Callahan felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had always known that teaching was about more than just lessons and grades. It was about protecting, guiding, and nurturing young lives. And in this moment, that purpose felt clearer than ever. The day moved on, and with it, a sense of closure began to settle over Ms. Callahan. The threat had passed, but the impact of the events lingered, shaping her in ways she hadn't anticipated. She had learned to trust her instincts more deeply, to question the things that seemed off, and to never underestimate the power of her role as a protector. As the final bell rang and the students began to file out of the classroom, Miss Callahan watched them go with a new sense of gratitude. Jimmy waved goodbye as he left with his mother, the weight of the past days lifting slowly from his small shoulders. There was still much to be uncovered, but for now, Miss Callahan allowed herself to breathe. She had done what she could, and the rest would unfold in time. Outside, the sun was shining brightly, casting warm golden rays over the playground. It felt like a new beginning, a chance to move forward, knowing that no matter what came next, she was ready. Even with the man in custody, the questions surrounding his motives weighed heavily on Miss Callahan's mind. Days had passed since his arrest, but the lingering uncertainty remained like a cloud over everything. She knew the police were still investigating, and as much as she wanted closure, the truth seemed elusive. Jimmy had returned to his usual quiet self, his routine at school slowly returning to normal. His mother had become a constant presence during drop-offs and pickups, never letting him out of her sight. Miss Callahan could sense her worry, though she tried her best to mask it. One afternoon, as the school day came to a close, Miss Callahan received a call from Officer Davis. She hadn't expected it, but the moment his name flashed on her phone, her heart skipped a beat. She answered quickly, eager for any news. Miss Callahan, Officer Davis began, his tone calm, but with a weight that immediately drew her in. I wanted to update you on the case. We've dug deeper into the man's history, and we've uncovered some disturbing details. Miss Callahan's grip on the phone tightened. What did you find? His name is Nathaniel Ross. He's been involved in several criminal activities over the years, including abductions and extortion. But here's where it gets complicated. His connection to Jimmy's family. Miss Callahan's breath caught. What kind of connection? We've learned that Jimmy's father, who passed away several years ago, had been involved in some business dealings that went south. Ross was part of that, and it seems he's been harboring a grudge ever since. Jimmy's family might not have been aware of the depth of Ross's anger, but it's clear now that he targeted Jimmy as a form of revenge. The revelation hit Ms. Callahan like a punch to the gut. She had known there was more to this, but to hear it laid out so plainly, it made everything feel even more sinister. "Does Jimmy's mother know about this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We've informed her, and she was shocked to say the least," Officer Davis replied. It seems she had no idea about her late husband's involvement with Ross. It's been a lot for her to process. Ms. Callahan felt a surge of sympathy for Jimmy's mother. She couldn't imagine what it must be like to discover that her child had been targeted because of something buried in the past. And Jimmy, what would he feel if he ever found out? "What happens next?" she asked. "The investigation is ongoing," Officer Davis explained. "Ross will be facing charges for the attempted abduction, and we're working to build a case around his other activities. For now, Jimmy and his mother are safe, but we'll continue to monitor the situation closely." Ms. Callahan thanked him for the update and hung up, her mind reeling. The truth was darker and more complicated than she had imagined, and it left her feeling uneasy. Jimmy's life had been touched by something he didn't even understand, and the weight of that knowledge felt heavy in her heart. She sat at her desk, staring at the papers scattered in front of her, but her mind was far from the classroom. She couldn't help but wonder how something that happened so long ago had come back to haunt Jimmy in such a dangerous way. And now that the truth was out, what would this mean for his future? As the school day ended and the students began to filter out of the building, Ms. Callahan caught sight of Jimmy walking toward the exit with his mother. She watched them go, her heart full of conflicting emotions. Jimmy was safe now, but the scars of this experience would likely stay with him and his family for a long time. The days that followed were quieter, but the impact of everything that had happened lingered in subtle ways. Ms. Callahan noticed it in the way Jimmy hesitated before answering questions in class, the way he stayed close to his mother during pickup, and the way his classmates seemed to give him space, as if sensing that something had changed. For Ms. Callahan, the experience had left her more vigilant than ever. She found herself constantly scanning her surroundings, her instincts heightened in ways she hadn't expected. It wasn't paranoia, exactly, more like an acute awareness of how quickly things could shift, how fragile safety could be. The school had implemented new security measures in the wake of the incident. The administration had made it clear that no unauthorized person would be allowed near the children, and the police presence around the school remained for weeks after Nathaniel Ross's arrest. There was a sense of relief, but also an understanding that they couldn't let their guard down. One afternoon, as Ms. Callahan was wrapping up her lesson, Jimmy's mother, Mrs. Thompson, appeared at the door. Her face, though still lined with stress, seemed lighter than it had been in the days following the incident. "Ms. Callahan, do you have a minute?" she asked, her voice gentle but determined. Ms. Callahan nodded, gesturing for her to come in. "Of course. Is everything all right?" Mrs. Thompson took a seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I just wanted to thank you again," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what we would have done if you hadn't stepped in. You saved my son's life." Ms. Callahan felt a lump rise in her throat. She had been thanked before by the police, by the school administration, but hearing it from Mrs. Thompson, hearing the raw emotion behind those words, made everything feel so much more real. "I was just doing what any teacher would do," Ms. Callahan said quietly. "But I'm so glad Jimmy's safe." Mrs. Thompson nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I wanted to let you know that we're moving," she said after a moment. "I've decided it's time for a fresh start, somewhere far from here. I think it's what Jimmy needs after everything that's happened." Ms. Callahan's heart ached at the news. She understood the need to move on, to distance themselves from the trauma, but the thought of saying goodbye to Jimmy, knowing the bond they had formed, was bittersweet. "That's completely understandable," Ms. Callahan said, offering a small smile. "I hope it helps him, and you, find some peace." Mrs. Thompson smiled through her tears. "I think it will. But I just wanted you to know how grateful we are. You've been such a blessing to us, more than you'll ever know." After a few more moments of heartfelt conversation, Mrs. Thompson stood, thanked Ms. Callahan once more, and left the classroom. Ms. Callahan sat in silence for a few moments, reflecting on how much had changed in such a short time. That afternoon, as the students filed out of the building, Ms. Callahan watched Jimmy one last time as he walked away with his mother. He looked back over his shoulder and waved, a small, almost shy smile on his face. Ms. Callahan waved back, her heart swelling with emotion. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the playground, and for the first time in weeks, Ms. Callahan felt a sense of closure. Jimmy would move on, and so would she. Life would continue, as it always did. But the lessons they had learned, the strength they had found in the face of fear, would stay with them. As the last of the students disappeared through the gates, Ms. Callahan stood by the window, watching the quiet of the afternoon settle over the school grounds. It was a new beginning for Jimmy and his family. And, in a way, it was a new beginning for her, too. A week had passed since Mrs. Thompson and Jimmy had moved away, and while the school had resumed its regular rhythm, Ms. Callahan still felt the absence of Jimmy's quiet presence in her classroom. The days felt different without the weight of constant vigilance pressing down on her, and though she had returned to her usual routine, her thoughts often drifted back to the events that had unfolded. The school had been a different place since the attempted abduction. The new security measures were still in place, and though the heightened police presence had eased somewhat, there remained a sense of caution among the staff and students. No one had forgotten how close they had come to something terrible, and the lessons learned during that time continued to shape their approach to safety and awareness. Ms. Callahan found herself reflecting on her own role in the situation. She had always considered herself a dedicated teacher, but the experience had changed her in ways she hadn't anticipated. It had made her more attuned to the small details, the subtle shifts in a child's behavior that could signal something deeper. It had also reminded her of the immense responsibility she carried, not just as an educator, but as a protector of the children entrusted to her care. One afternoon, as she prepared for the day's lessons, Ms. Callahan received an unexpected letter. It was from Jimmy. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened the envelope, her fingers trembling slightly. Inside was a short note, written in Jimmy's small, careful handwriting. Dear Ms. Callahan, I wanted to say thank you for everything. I know it was scary, but you helped me feel safe when I didn't know if I could be. My mom says we're going to be okay, and I believe her. I miss my friends at school, but I think I'm ready for a fresh start, just like you said. You were the best teacher I ever had. Jimmy. Ms. Callahan felt a lump rise in her throat as she read the words. She hadn't realized how much the bond between her and Jimmy had meant to him, but seeing it laid out so simply, so sincerely, filled her with emotion. She had spent so much time worrying about whether she had done enough, whether she had protected him in the right way, and now she knew that she had. Tears welled up in her eyes as she folded the letter and placed it gently in her desk drawer. It was a small token, but it meant the world to her. Jimmy's words reminded her of why she had chosen this path in the first place, to make a difference in the lives of her students, to be there for them when they needed someone the most. As she sat in the quiet of her classroom, the sun streaming through the windows, Ms. Callahan felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. She had done her part, and Jimmy had found his way forward. It wasn't the ending she had expected, but it was one that brought closure. As the school year began to wind down, Ms. Callahan felt the familiar mix of exhaustion and satisfaction that came with the end of each term. The students were preparing for their final projects, their excitement palpable as they talked about summer plans and the next grade level. Life had returned to normal, but was a new normal, shaped by the events that had unfolded earlier in the year. The staff had also changed in subtle ways. There was a greater sense of camaraderie, a shared understanding of the responsibility they all bore. Meetings about student safety were taken more seriously, and teachers paid closer attention to the signs of distress in their students. The school had become a more vigilant place, and while the fear of another incident had lessened, the awareness remained. One afternoon, as Ms. Callahan sat at her desk grading papers, she was interrupted by a knock on the door. She looked up to see Mr. Howard, the principal, standing in the doorway, a warm smile on his face. "Mind if I come in?" he asked. "Of course," Ms. Callahan replied, gesturing for him to take a seat. Mr. Howard sat down, folding his hands in his lap. "I just wanted to check in with you," he said. "It's been a few weeks since everything with Jimmy, and I wanted to see how you were doing." Ms. Callahan smiled softly. "I'm doing all right. It was a lot to process, but I think I've come out of it stronger. I've learned a lot about myself, about the kids, about what it means to be a teacher in situations like that." Mr. Howard nodded. "I couldn't agree more. What you did for Jimmy, for this school, it hasn't gone unnoticed. I've spoken to the district, and they're considering implementing some of the security measures we put in place here across other schools. Your quick thinking and dedication really set an example." Ms. Callahan felt a flush of pride, though she remained humble. "I just did what I thought was right, but it's good to know that something positive is coming out of it all." Mr. Howard smiled again, his eyes filled with admiration. "It's more than that, Ms. Callahan. You've shown everyone here what it means to truly care about these kids, to go beyond just teaching them, and to be their protector. That's something we can all learn from." Ms. Callahan felt a swell of emotion at his words. She hadn't sought recognition for what she had done, but hearing the impact it had made on the school filled her with a deep sense of fulfillment. As Mr. Howard stood to leave, he paused at the door, turning back to her. "Thank you, Ms. Callahan, for everything." Ms. Callahan smiled, her heart full. "Thank you." As the day wound to a close and the students began filing out of the building, Ms. Callahan stood by the window, watching them go. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the playground, and she felt a sense of peace wash over her. It was a new chapter, both for her and for the school. The trials they had faced had made them stronger, more aware, and more connected. And while there would always be challenges ahead, Ms. Callahan knew that she and her students were ready for them. The final bell rang, and as the last of the students disappeared through the gates, Ms. Callahan gathered her things and walked out of the classroom, feeling lighter than she had in months. She glanced back at the empty room one last time before stepping outside, knowing that she had done her part and the rest would follow. It was the end of one chapter, but the beginning of another, a chapter filled with hope, resilience, and the unwavering belief that no matter what, they would persevere. Thank you so much for watching this story. If you enjoyed it, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It helps us bring you more amazing content. We'd also love to hear from you. What part of a story had the most impact on you? Was it a specific moment, character, or twist? Let us know in the comments below. And if you have any ideas for future stories or themes you'd like to see on the channel, we'd love to hear your suggestions. Your feedback is super important to us, and who knows, your idea might just become our next big story.